I'm Thomas, and this is Ben, and today we've finally organized ourselves to record one of our famous philosophical discussions. Do you have anything to say, Ben?
Well, we're going to be starting off with the liar paradox. So it goes something like this. Take, for example, the sentence, "This sentence is false." Or you could take something like, "The following sentence is false. The preceding sentence is true." Both of those create a paradox. And the strange thing is that they seem to contradict the second basic law of logic, the law of the excluded middle, which states that for any proposition A, either A or not A must be true. And so we're going to try to figure out how to resolve this seeming contradiction.
I'd like to maybe make a brief mention. I have limited experience in philosophy, but in the class that I do have, I think I'll go briefly over inductive and deductive arguments. For example, the liar's paradox would be a inductive process, and I guess it could be either, but in the way I'm looking at it, a inductive process is made up of a bunch of prepositions. And as the second law has been mentioned, it could either be true or not true. Those are the only possibilities. However, the liar's paradox is an exception to this. It breaks that law. But in terms of making an inductive argument, for the most part, your prepositions are either true or false, and then you draw a conclusion. And one interesting thing, it's slightly irrelevant, but one interesting thing is that there's this ongoing debate about mathematics and whether it should be considered a field of empiricalness or rationality, in the sense that can we, without our senses, through sheer rationality, begin to do math, or do we need our empirical senses to see somebody else do it, or to get some kind of sensation of somebody else doing it for us to do it ourselves? And not sure I was going with that.
Yeah, that sounds sort of more like epistemology than
right.
Logic.
That we're off topic. Let's get back on track.
Anyway, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, not what you mean, but where you got this information about inductive arguments and deductive arguments, because if I remember correctly, an inductive argument is one in which the conclusion follows from the premises with a certain probability, while a deductive argument is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true.
Well, I personally got this information from my philosophy class, and not to criticize you, but at least according to my teacher, that second statement you mentioned is either incomplete or false, in the sense that you are correct, and for the conclusion to be true, the preposition must be true. However, there's a step that you missed out, either intentionally or unintentionally. I doubt you're trying to be intentional in this, but the step you left out is logic, in the sense that you could have a preposition that is true and have a conclusion that the preposition does not, for example, destroy. However, if the logic, I believe the proper term is unsound, if the logic of the argument is unsound in terms of the conclusion, then the conclusion is false. Although that's not necessarily agreeing with or disagreeing with what you said, but apart from that, that's the real difference, in the sense that a deductive argument, you have a preposition, you have to have sound logic, and then you have a reasonable conclusion if the preposition is true and the logic is sound. Whereas a inductive argument is a bunch of prepositions that are either true or untrue, and based off of whether they're true or not true, a conclusion can be drawn. However, you mentioned that there's a certain probability, and I'm kind of interested, where did you get the notion that we get a certain probability? I would just like your reasoning.
Well, I don't get, when I say probability, by the way, I don't mean in terms of an actual percentage or anything. Mm-hmm. I only mean that you consider an argument inductively strong if the conclusion probably follows from the premises, and inductively weak if it probably doesn't. And where I got this definition of an inductive argument was from a logic class from Oxford University that, it was a free logic class, but it's still a logic class from Oxford.
All right. In that case, I'm not going to doubt your source. I mean, I'm sure that it's some pretty good stuff. I'm not going to disagree with that. However, in terms of, for example, you mentioned if the majority of the prepositions used happen to be true, you kind of get a stronger conclusion, whereas if the majority of them aren't true, you get a weaker kind of conclusion. One interesting question that my philosophy teacher, who does not work at Oxford, but just at the humble institution of John Abbott, one thing he mentioned, and he asked us in class, is how many prepositions are necessary for an argument to be considered true. And the whole thing he was getting at is that it would need all of them, which is often an impossibility. One example he gave is that in the 17th century, there's this French dude that specialized in swans, and he came to the conclusion after analyzing every single species of swan, or are they all one species? I'm not sure. But after checking all the swans, he became convinced that in order for something to be a swan is white, and all swans are white. He had never seen any proposition which disproved that, and therefore it became the common definition of a swan. However, I'm not sure how later, but at one point, some dudes went to Australia, and they discovered a black swan in Australia, which completely destroyed this argument because it's one false preposition, but that was all it took to derail the conclusion he came to that all swans are white. So I'm just putting that out there, but for the most part, it would be fair to say that if a lot of prepositions support something, it's more probable, but I don't think it's fair to say that you could get to the point where you could guarantee anything like that without examining all possibilities of a preposition, all prepositions, which as far as I think is an impossibility.
Well, I'm not sure exactly why this is relevant since...
Oh, yeah, no, this is completely irrelevant. This is just a tangent. We should really get to the liar paradox. Yeah.
So, the liar paradox actually, it isn't an argument at all, really.
No.
It's just it's a proposition.
Yeah.
Which can be true or false, or maybe not, is what we're trying to find out. So, I came up with several possible solutions to this, and I disproved one, I think, and some of the others I think, are just probably false. So I'm going to ask you first what you came up with, if anything.
All right, so this was actually mentioned at one of our previous discussions briefly. I remember at that point when you mentioned that this disproves the second law of logic, I believe you called it, in the sense that a preposition is either true or false, but the phrase, this sentence is false, is a paradox. And my initial thinking is that, yes, this is a paradox, and it does disprove the law. And in the short term, at least, I'm thinking, this is a paradox. There's no real way to bypass it in terms of how I could think in the short term, where the fact that something is true or false, and then the sentence being a paradox, I don't think that those things can coexist and both of them be true, where the paradox and the second law of logic, either the second law of logic is disproven by this paradox, although it doesn't have to be in all senses. Our conversation came to the conclusion that the paradox could exist, and the second law of logic exists in all cases except for in the case of the paradox, which I believe is the conclusion I arrived at. Or, for example, the paradox can be solved in such a way that the second law of logic can be maintained in all instances. So that's what I've got so far. It's not much, but I'm interested to see what you have to say on the subject.
Okay, so I also thought of what if the second law of logic applies for all cases except the liar paradox. But, that's kind of an arbitrary distinction.
Yeah.
So I sort of threw that one out. The second thing I came up with was, what if the liar paradox is false simply by virtue of it being a paradox? What if all paradoxes are just considered false and that's the end of the story?
That is an interesting possibility. I had not thought of that, Ben.
But then I I think I disproved that, and I wrote down how I disproved it, but then looking back at it, I'm not quite sure exactly what it meant. So, how I thought I disproved that went something like this. So I came up with another paradox, or maybe it's not a paradox, I don't know. Not yet, anyway. I called it the paradox. It goes like this. This sentence is paradoxical.
Oh, I see what you did there, Ben. I see what you did there.
So, here's what I thought. I thought, well, if you just say that this sentence is paradoxical, is false, then no paradox arises. Everything's consistent, so we have our answer. It's false. But if it's false, it cannot be true, which is obvious. And in order for it to be true that this sentence is paradoxical, a paradox would have to arise in the sentence. So we cannot allow anything to happen that would cause a paradox to arise in the sentence. However, I thought, and this is the step where I kind of don't know what I was talking about, I thought, if it is true that anything is false simply by virtue of it being a paradox, then this sentence is paradoxical, becomes a paradox in itself. And I'm not sure exactly how it becomes a paradox by that. I don't know, maybe I was just confused when I thought that, or maybe I'm just too tired now to understand what I said. But that's what I thought. And so, if that is the case, then it cannot be true that something is false simply by virtue of it being a paradox.
All right, so when you're telling me this very fascinating story, the conclusion that I immediately arrived at as soon as you mentioned that was the second thing you mentioned, the possibility, for example, the sentence is a paradox. If this sentence is a paradox, the fact that the sentence is a paradox renders it not a paradox, which is the second conclusion you came at. And that's just my immediate thinking, and if I'm going to think about that real hard right now, if this sentence is a paradox, by virtue of it being a paradox, this sentence cannot be a paradox. Does that make any sense, Ben?
I think I lost you there. But, I'll have to work this out sometime when I'm not
it's possible
so
that I lost
tired.
myself there. I mean, if you were to write it down, like, for example, algebraically, well, not literally algebraically, but in terms of preposition, this sentence is a paradox would be one preposition. We could call it preposition A. And based off the second law of logic, preposition A is either true or false, which is what you mentioned originally when discussing this. Now, I'm going to analyze exclusively the possibility that this preposition is true. And what's interesting is that a conclusion of prepositions can be used as a preposition itself for another argument. There's nothing to stop that from happening. And I'm thinking that if this sentence is a paradox, preposition is determined to be true, by the very nature of what a paradox is, I'm starting to question whether this is a paradox or not, Ben.
See, what I thought is it's not a paradox at first, but if it were true that something is false simply by virtue of it being a paradox, then the statement would become a paradox.
Yes, it would be.
And we can't allow that.
Right. And that would be. What I don't like about that is the fact that in order for this paradox to exist, all paradoxes must be false. And although I understand it in terms of how it is a paradox, the fact that that is necessary for that to become a paradox, I find is somewhat limiting.
But the very point is that we can't allow this to become a paradox, because that would contradict our initial conclusion that the statement is false.
So by saying that this sentence is a paradox is false, because all paradoxes are false, creates another paradox, which means that saying that all paradoxes are false is not correct. Am I right in trying to understand this?
I don't think you are, but then again, I'm not sure.
Such is the nature of all philosophical things.
Anyway, I think we can abandon this for now. Another reason I came up with against this was pretty much just because I think it sort of redefines the word false in order to say that all paradoxes are false. So yeah, that's two options down the hole for now. Another idea I came up with is I first looked at the other version of the liar paradox, which is the following sentence is false, the preceding sentence is true, or something like that. And so I tried making just one of these sentences false and the other true, and the other way around, and both of them false and both of them true, and in no way did it work.
Yeah.
And then I also thought, what if I could break the one sentence liar paradox into two separate sentences, because it actually has two different meanings at two different points in the paradox, and doing the same thing to it. And I tried it, and it also didn't work, so that one also goes down the hole.
Alright, so based off of what you just told me, and of course we're not professionals and we haven't analyzed this to the point of being experts on it by any stretch of the imagination, but based off of what you just told me, I think that so far at least, the conclusion that we've come to until we come up with any new groundbreaking evidence is that this paradox is existent. This paradox exists. We can't just shove it out of the way. It will exist, and we can't simply get rid of the liar's paradox or solve it by saying that paradoxes can't exist. Therefore, we must accept it, and one way or another, we must either find a way for it to coexist with the second law of logic or disprove the second law of logic. But between you and me, that doesn't sound like a great idea. So the conclusion I've come to, at least so far, is that the best option we got, and this is not the greatest thing in the world, but I think it's the greatest option we have so far, is that we must accept that this paradox disproves the second law of logic, but apart from that, the second law of logic is true, except for in that instance, which kind of redefines the definition of true. So I think that we could maybe say that like this: the second law of logic is true, except for under the condition of a paradox. And I'm not sure if there's other examples of paradoxes breaking laws of logic, or any laws in general, although I suppose by definition of a paradox that could be the case. But then again, this is all hypothetical. Paradoxes and philosophical laws aren't physical things that can be physically broken. So I guess it all depends on how deep you want to interpret it, but that's what I've come to at least.
Before I proceed, I just want to point out that I looked at the article in the liar paradox in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Okay.
And I only looked at the table of contents, but it seemed that basically all the solutions people have come up with are integrated into advanced systems of formal logic. So I guess we're not going to be investigating that. But I do have one more possible solution. I think this is the one I like the best.
Okay.
So note that the second law of logic states, for any proposition A, either A or not A must be true.
Okay.
So since it's only for propositions, things like questions, what is your name, cannot be true or false, and also things that are simply unintelligible, like canoe, banana, is.
Buffalo, buffalo, buffalo.
Yeah, that's not true or false also. And so I thought, well, the liar paradox makes no sense by virtue of it being a paradox, you know. And so perhaps...
It is not, in fact, a preposition at all?
Yeah, something like that.
Well, I gotta say, that actually does sound pretty well thought out in the sense that not only would that allow the second law of logic to proceed, it maintains the liar's paradox as a paradox. It simply excludes paradoxes from being considered prepositions. Yeah. wonder, I guess you haven't done any research on it, but I wonder if under this Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy or logic or whatnot, if it ever gives you the definition of a preposition in terms of logic, and whether it specifically mentions paradoxes in terms of being accepted as or rejected as prepositions, because that could be something interesting that we might want to check out afterwards.
Perhaps. I don't know at this moment. Of course, we could check that out later.
Yeah.
So do you wish to proceed on to the second subject of free will?
Oh, yeah, sure. Let's go ahead.
Okay. So, first of all, I do believe in free will, libertarian free will. I'm an incompatibilist, which means I do not believe that determinism is compatible with free will. Although the majority of philosophers, I think, are compatibilists. And so...
Yeah, what's that name of that Protestant group that believes in predestination and all that?
Those are Calvinists.
Yeah.
So, I suppose we could start off by defining our terms.
Right.
So, I would use the word causal determinism to mean that the people's wills are determined by the predictable motion of atoms. Like a clock wound up from the beginning and it just keeps going and you can predict how it's going to go and it doesn't have any control over itself.
Okay.
And then we can go to libertarian free will is a form of free will that believes that determinism is not compatible with free will. And then I will use the term predestination to refer to a system in which its wills are not determined by atoms but by God.
All right. So, if I were to sum this up for the viewers that might not have the same kind of vocabulary that Ben has, if I were to really simplify that, he gives three possibilities. There's the scientific possibility that we have no free will, atoms kind of move around randomly and that's the way it is. There's the libertarian view, which basically means we have free will, and that is incompatible with the previously mentioned statement. And there is the religious one, in which there's no atoms involved, but God gives us a predestined destiny kind of thing. Is that a fair summary, Ben?
Yeah, that's about it.
All right.
So I'm going to ask you first if you do have already a position or if you're leaning towards a position.
All right, well, I gotta say, and this is really interesting, there's actually a psychology study. I know about this since I took a psychology class last semester, but it's called the locus of control. And it was a study given to a bunch of people. I think that it's a random sample of the American population, although probably not completely random, but it is a sample. And they basically asked a bunch of questions where the answer either lends yourself to you have control over what happens to you and the outside world, or you kind of surrender control. And they found that a lot of people do tend to believe in free will in the sense that they have control over their immediate surroundings. However, there is a large amount of people that believe they have zero control over certain aspects of their life, things like, for example, the government or other things that might seem like big processes, where what can them as a single person do against such a big structure, where they're just kind of going to resign themselves to living within it, and that's it. In terms of my own opinion, I gotta say, when I took that locus of control, which the teacher made us take, I answered mostly towards the free will side. However, there were a couple of things, and when I answered I don't have control, I didn't mean that I literally don't have control. I simply meant that the decisions I make most likely would not change the outcome of this situation, which I think is what a lot of, general people might think, especially in terms of stuff like politics. But it doesn't mean that they don't have free will. It simply means that they doubt that their ability to make a decision can have any meaningful impact on the bigger picture.
Okay. So, I guess what I got out of that is that you're leaning towards free will. And that most people do also.
If you want to sum it up real briefly, then yeah, that's about it.
Okay. So I'm going to put my first argument for free will something like this. It's basically that that's the... Not that I have any indication that that is the correct choice, but that is the one that for practical purposes you should choose. Because, I mean, if predestination or determinism is true, then you don't have a choice over which option you choose anyway.
Ooh, I like it. Very philosophical.
So, I mean, you may as well choose this one. I guess you have an excuse if it's the wrong choice. There's probably a better way to put it than that, but...
No, I like the way you put it so far.
Okay, so now I guess we could start discussing compatibilism, for instance. Do you think that determinism, the motion of atoms determining everything, is compatible with free will?
Well, that's a real interesting one, because I remember last year when we were in Mr. Murray's physics class, he showed that one episode of quantum physics, and it went on to describe how at the quantum level, things are incredibly unpredictable, that, for example, he once threw himself at a door to try to pass through it, to prove the point that it was incredibly unlikely that he would pass through the door. However, at the quantum level, so many things are going on that things that would otherwise seem impossible to us happen on a regular basis. For example, small particles passing through, solid objects. Well, technically, atoms don't touch each other when I touch a chair, for example, but that's a whole other thing. Mm-hmm. All that to say, if I weren't to think about it a lot, I'd say that my innate position would definitely probably be compatibilism, in the sense that I think, and I mean, I'm interested to see what you got to say about this. I think that it makes sense that atoms' movements kind of do things. They decide how things move. And I don't think that necessarily stops us from being able to make our own decisions, our own movements, where I don't believe that, for example, the atoms are predestined to do things. I think they simply do things regardless of us. However, we have larger control over the big picture, and we're not necessarily slaves to the, movement our atoms do.
But is it the atoms that determine what you do, or is it
you that determine what the atoms do? That is the question, Ben. Now, I feel as if that's the kind of question you want to ask all compatibilists, because it kind of puts them on the spot where they're like, make a decision, you got to do it, you can't stay compatibilist, you got to, But in terms of what I'm going to answer to that, I don't know, is it a common, compatibilist thing to say something like atoms, and this doesn't make any sense literally, but atoms are independent of us, and us are independent of atoms? I mean, that makes no sense, because we're made up of atoms, so...
Well, I mean, there's mind-body dualism.
That's actually something interesting. That was mentioned in my philosophy class a couple days ago. And in order for that to be true, you have to have at least some belief in, for example, the idea of a non-corporeal mind potentially being held together by an ectoplasm, otherwise known as a spirit. And then that goes into a whole theological discussion, which isn't what we're here for, but that is one way that could possibly make things true.
Well, I think most compatibilists are compatibilists because they like the idea of free will, but they're not mind-body dualists.
Okay.
So they want to have free will. They want to have their cake and eat it too, as the saying goes.
Alright. So, if I had to do a real quick analysis of what you said, you're saying that the only way for you to have real free will is for mind-body dualism to be a thing. If that doesn't exist, then you don't have free will because of the way that the atoms go and all that. The only way for you to really have free will over your movement and essentially everything is for mind-body dualism to be true. And of course, whether you believe in mind-body dualism or not doesn't decide whether you have free will. I mean, if, for example, what you're saying is true and we all have free will, the people that believe we don't have free will have the free will to choose they don't have free will. And the compatibilists, they too have free will and they exercise it. They simply choose to believe in something which, based off of your argument, is impossible, but they still live their life as if they have free will, which I think is better than living your life as if you don't have free will. Also, people with free will tend to take responsibility for their actions, which I think everybody should do. And I mean, not that people do this, but if somebody were to do something, say, I don't have free will, I'm not responsible for murdering that guy, I don't think that's a legitimate argument in court or anywhere.
Yeah. Actually, surprisingly enough, it was the atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett. He's one of the four horsemen of atheism, of new atheism. He wrote a book on free will. He doesn't believe in full free will, the kind of free will that I do. He sort of believes in a type that we'll discuss later. But he made an argument that it said, imagine you had a guy who underwent some kind of surgery, and when he woke up, the people at the hospital told him that they had put a chip in his brain and they were going to control all of his actions, and he would think he had free will, but he really didn't.
And by doing so, he would believe he didn't have free will, and even if they did nothing to him, he would live the rest of his life as if he was controlled, when in reality, this is just a mind experiment.
Really, in the end, what would happen to the guy, in this analogy, is he'd start being less and less careful of what he did. He wouldn't try to be more self-controlled, because
what does it matter? Yeah, if that's the case, what does it matter what you do, what you say, if you don't have control? You don't take responsibility for anything you do at all. You just kind of say, oh, well, they're the ones making me doing it, leading to more rash behavior, risky behavior, that could have you die. Because what difference does it make if you have no control? You're not responsible, therefore you just kind of lay back and laisse faire.
So, the thing that the compatibilists do is that they sort of redefine free will to say that it's compatible with determinism.
Okay.
And so what they say is it's free will because you act according to your motivations, even though those motivations are determined, and that it's the movement of atoms that makes you act according to your motivations.
So you're saying that this argument is false because it doesn't, disprove or solve the problem that atoms are responsible for your movement unless you believe in mind-body dualism.
I mean, I think under this definition of free will, a calculator has free will. And I think we all agree that a calculator does not have free will. So what's the point of calling it free will if every technical object has it and such? It's clearly not the right definition of free will.
I would agree with that, and I think that's a solid way to kind of fight that argument, where I don't think any, mutualists, I like that term, sorry. I don't think any mutualists, when they put that argument forth, are thinking in their head, right, every calculator and toaster and microwave has as much free will as we do. Unless they believe we have no free will, in which case they would be true if they believe that, but they're mutualists, therefore they think that some free will is involved, therefore they're wrong. But what I'm curious, and you probably mentioned it before, I just wasn't paying attention, but you said by the nature of their very argument, they have free will in acting according to their, what was the term you used? Their,
I don't remember saying any of this, but
Oh, sorry, I think you mentioned that the mutualists believe that people act according, not to their wants, but their, needs or desires.
Motivations.
Motivations, yes, that's the term you used. Now, of course, you disproved, or you attempted to disprove what the mutualists said, but I don't think that the mutualists believe that the toast...
The term is compatibilists, by the way.
Okay, I'll go back to the... Okay.
Okay, was that something you were making up and using it on purpose?
Oh, I kind of was. I mean, they kind of mean the same thing. I meant the same thing when I said mutualist. It's just a word that came to my mind.
Say whatever you want.
All right, just kind of the word circle in my vocabulary in my mind. Anyways, yeah, so the mutualists, I don't believe that they believe the toasters or the calculators or whatnot have any motivations. I mean, that depends on how you define motivation, of course. But
what is a motivation? Isn't it just a reason for acting the way you do? And don't calculators act for a reason?
Well, it sounds to me like you just explained that calculators have no motivations. Unless I misunderstood you.
Well, isn't a motivation a reason for doing what you do? And don't calculators have reasons for doing what they do?
When you speak of motivation in terms of doing what they were made to do or supposed to do, I think that you could say that a calculator's purpose is to be pressed by fingers in order to give you mathematical answers to problems. But I think there's a difference between purpose and motivation. I mean, I could be wrong, just the way I'm using motivation is wrong. But I think that in terms of the way that motivation is used as a word, it's kind of anthropomorphized in the sense that we tend to associate it with humans and potentially animals, but that's a whole other discussion, and not necessarily in the, say, physics term, which I think it's what you're going with here.
Well, I'm not sure either what the compatibilists mean by motivation. They could be meaning the emotion, but of course that doesn't make sense. You can't have free will just by virtue of you having a certain emotion.
A lot of scientists go on. I remember Mr. Murray did this on Valentine's Day in our sci-fi class, explaining how love was just chemical imbalance in the brain, and went on to say that the whole point of that is for, your innate instinct to propagate the species, and such is the case for, I think he mentioned all emotions, where they're just, for example, innate instincts, for example, that try to keep you alive and follow the other goals that are put forth by a species, which is, the main goal of any species is to propagate itself to ensure the survival of its race. And the fact that humans are arguably sentient and self-reflective, that might sort of change the cycle, but I don't think that kind of overwrites our biological instinct.
Yes, emotions are biological.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. So I guess I'd need a definition of motivation from a compatibilist themselves. But it seems kind of an arbitrary thing to make free will a thing, sort of.
Yeah, no, I could see what you're saying there. And of course, I don't know of any compatibilists that would be willing to represent their whole opinion, especially just to us. We can't just walk up to some well-known compatibilist and be like, "Good morrow, sir. Would you mind appearing on our radio show?"
Well, the only definition for motivation I can think of at the moment is acting according to a reason. And that is what calculators do.
When you say acting according to a reason, you mean you press the buttons and that's why the numbers display. I know that's a very simplistic, barbaric interpretation, but is that kind of what you mean?
I'm actually not sure myself.
Well, and if I'm not sure, you're not sure, and the mutualists aren't sure, then I guess this is a bit of a roadblock.
Okay, I guess we can move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
I'm actually not sure if it qualifies as compatibilism or as part of libertarian free will. I've seen it as part of the latter, but I think it may also be part of the former.
Okay.
And it's based on quantum mechanics, quantum physics.
Mm-hmm.
It's not sure exactly what it's called. It might be called Heisenberg free will. I'm just going to call it randomness free will. It's basically the theory that you have free will because the motion of the atoms aren't predictable. They move with a sort of randomness.
Okay. off the top of my head, I'm thinking to myself, how does that make any sense? And you could explain it, that's just the immediate thing that came to my mind. How does this make sense? So if you could try to explain it, I'm not sure if it's your opinion or not, but I think some explaining is in order, if for not the viewers, just for me.
Well, I think these are people who would define free will as when your will can't be completely predicted, with 100% accuracy, which I don't think is a correct definition of free will.
Oh, and I would agree with that assessment 100%. I mean, things being random doesn't equal free will. I mean, that's a very brief summary of what that whole idea is, but I'm with Ben in that does not make sense.
Yeah, so I sort of thought of an illustration of if you were to make some kind of magic box that we can call, I don't know, the Heisenberg box, and this box was shoved into the brain of somebody in surgery and connected to the brain so that it would control all of their actions. And this Heisenberg box operates with complete randomness. Well, not complete randomness, within certain probabilities, but it still has randomness, and it controls their actions. We wouldn't say that this person has free will.
All right. I'm kind of sad to mention this, but I do have a anthropology test coming up in about half an hour, and I would like to study for it just a tad bit. We never got to the part where we discussed National Socialism, sadly. That would have been a fun topic, but I think just for the sake of my marks so far, I'd like to cut this one a little short, Ben, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I guess we're done here.
Yeah, I don't know if we have like an outro music or some kind of motto or thing we want to say at the end.
I don't have a motto, but I was planning on putting some classical music for the intro and outro.
Ooh, I do like the sound of that. I'm not sure if you could get access to it, but that clip from Freedom Tunes where the Shapiros destroyed the turkey that says socialism works, I just like that. I'm not sure what relevance it would have to us, but I just found that kind of comical. I don't know if you could find a way to splice that in, or anything similar to that, or your own version. I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, no, it would be really funny. This is just something I thought of whenever my philosophy teacher mentions the idea of Descartes' evil demon. He always puts like his little two fingers next to his head and he makes some kind of sound. And sometimes he makes students come up with their own sound. And I swear the next time, if he ever asks me for the sound, I'm going to do it and I'm going to say, socialism works. I know, I feel like that'd be funny, the devil saying socialism works. What do you think?
I think it would be realistic.
All right, I think on that note, we could call it a day.
All right, that is all.
I'm Thomas.
I'm Ben.
And this is us wishing you good night.
Or whatever time of day it is.
That's true.